You won't believe what happened when an HOA Karen kept using my hose without asking. It was the last straw, and I decided to take matters into my own hands in the most unexpected way. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind that prides itself on perfect lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of conformity. Every house looks almost identical, except for the few that stick out like mine, which is a garden that I'm incredibly proud of. The neighborhood is run by a homeowners association, HOA, which I'm sure was meant to keep everything looking neat and tidy, but in reality, it's a place for petty rules and arbitrary fines. At first, I had no issue with the HOA. I respected the rules. But then came Karen, the living embodiment of everything I've come to dislike about the HOA. Karen is a middle-aged woman who has somehow wormed her way onto the HOA board. And let me tell you, she takes her job very seriously. If you so much as have a twig out of place, you can expect a warning letter from her. She's the type of person who patrols the neighborhood like a sheriff, always looking for something to complain about. I didn't think she'd ever bother me. My garden is my pride and joy. I've spent years cultivating it, and it's beautiful, full of vibrant flowers, neatly arranged flower beds, and perfectly manicured hedges. But that didn't stop Karen. One day, she came up to my front door uninvited, her eyes scanning the yard with a judgmental look on her face. "You know," she said, "I've noticed your garden hose out here. It's a bit unsightly, don't you think? You might want to move it somewhere less visible." I blinked, surprised. A hose? It was just a garden hose, sitting there after I'd been watering my plants that morning. Sure, it wasn't tucked away out of sight, but was it really a big deal? I responded as politely as I could, trying to defuse the situation. "It's just a hose, Karen. I use it every day to water my plants. I don't think it's hurting anything." She shook her head as if I were a child who didn't understand the importance of appearances. "It's all about curb appeal," she said with a condescending smile. "We can't have things looking out of place. I suggest you move it inside or hide it in the garage." I try to keep my cool. "It's just a hose. It's not like it's something that's disrupting the neighborhood." Karen wasn't hearing it. "The rules are the rules," she replied, "and I'm just trying to help you out before the HOA gets involved." I was taken aback. "Are you threatening me with the HOA over a hose?" She didn't flinch. Not threatening, just a friendly reminder. I knew this wouldn't end with just a polite conversation, but I let it go for the moment. Karen left, but her words lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the hose she was after, it was my entire yard. Her need to control everything was starting to get under my skin. A few days later, the problem escalated. I walked outside in the morning to find that my garden hose was missing from its usual spot. I stood there, confused for a moment, and then I saw Karen in her front yard. She had the hose in her hands, watering her flowers, my hose. I walked over, my heart racing with frustration. "Karen, what are you doing with my hose?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though it came out more as a question than a request. "Oh, I just needed a little water for my flowers," she said casually, not even offering a glance of guilt. "It's no big deal, right? You have so much water here, I thought I'd just use some of it." I stood there in disbelief. "You can't just use my things without asking." She waved her hand dismissively. "It's just a hose. You're overreacting." I couldn't believe it. Not only was she blatantly disrespecting my property, but she also had the nerve to downplay it like I was the one being unreasonable. I could feel my frustration bubbling up, but I took a deep breath to stay calm. "Please, Karen," I said, trying to remain polite. "Just ask next time before you take something from my yard." She rolled her eyes. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just a hose." The next few weeks were a blur of similar incidents. Every time I stepped outside, I'd find Karen using my hose, whether it was to water her garden, wash her car, or even spray down her driveway. The worst part? I wasn't always there when it happened. It became clear that she was using my hose whenever she felt like it, without a care in the world. It wasn't just about the hose anymore. It was about the principle of the thing. I'd come home to find her finishing up watering her plants, standing proudly next to my hose, with no apology or acknowledgement of the inconvenience she was causing. Each time, I'd ask her what she was doing, and each time, she'd offer the same casual excuse, as if it were normal. She never asked. She never apologized. She simply took what she wanted. I tried to be patient. I tried to ignore it, but the more she used the hose, the more I realized this was a pattern. She was taking advantage of my good nature, assuming that I wouldn't care. But I did. I cared deeply. The audacity of it, the blatant disrespect, was driving me mad. One afternoon, I'd arrive home to find Karen washing her car in my driveway, using my hose, of course. I stood there in shock, watching her rinse off her vehicle with my water, and my patience finally snapped. "Karen," I shouted, walking towards her. "What are you doing? This is ridiculous." She didn't even flinch. "Oh, calm down. I just needed to rinse my car." I was livid. "No, Karen, this has gone too far. You cannot keep using my hose without my permission." She shrugged and turned back to her car. "You're being way too uptight about this. It's just a hose, and it's not like you're using it right now." That was it. I was done. I had asked. I had begged. I had tried to reason with her. But Karen had no intention of respecting my property, my boundaries, or my wishes. I knew something needed to change, and I needed to take matters into my own hands. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop until she had her way, and I had to find a way to put an end to it. The question was, how? How could I stop her from using my hose again? That's when I came up with a plan. After weeks of enduring Karen's relentless hose usage, I knew something had to be done. This wasn't a case of simple inconvenience anymore. It had become an ongoing violation of my personal space. Karen had crossed the line more than once, and each time, I tried to remain calm and civil, but it was clear that my politeness was being seen as weakness. I couldn't let this go on any longer. It wasn't just the hose anymore, it was the principle of it all. Karen felt entitled to my property, and that was something I simply couldn't accept. I had to get creative. I thought about various ways to stop her from using my hose without directly confronting her, because I knew she wouldn't back down just because I asked nicely. The idea I came up with wasn't exactly conventional, but it was a solution that would ensure she never used my hose again, and I could do it without directly confronting her again. I spent the next few days researching, looking up articles on neighborhood disputes, creative revenge tactics, and ways to deal with entitled people like Karen. What I eventually landed on was a plan that I knew would work, turning the hose into something she'd never want to use again. The first step was simple. I needed to cut off the hose from its usual connection to the water supply. The problem with that was it would render it useless for both of us, and I wasn't ready to do that just yet. I needed to make sure that, in her mind, using my hose would become a horrible experience, something she would actively avoid. And then, just in case she got the idea to reconnect the hose herself, I needed a failsafe. That's where the real genius of the plan came in. I went to the local hardware store and bought a few materials. I didn't need anything fancy, just some supplies to rig the hose in a way that would make it unusable, at least for her. I also made sure to grab a few items that would let me play a small joke on her. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to stop her from taking advantage of me. My plan involved setting up a system that would make her think twice before using the hose ever again. The next morning, I got to work. I walked out into the backyard with the materials I had bought. I had a strange sense of satisfaction as I began setting up the hose to implement my plan. Karen wouldn't know what hit her. I started by detaching the hose from its original connection and running it to a new setup, a sewage tank. It seemed like the perfect solution. If she wanted to use my hose, she'd be in for a nasty surprise. I spent an hour carefully installing the hose onto the tank, securing everything properly so it would look like a completely normal setup from a distance. At first glance, everything appeared to be as it should. The hose was connected and lying innocuously on the ground, ready for its next unsuspecting user. Then, I began working on the failsafe. I knew Karen wasn't the type of person to inspect a hose thoroughly before using it. So I needed to ensure that once the hose was turned on, it would immediately unleash something unpleasant. I rigged up a simple mechanism inside the tank so that when the water was turned on, it would start flowing through the hose, but not water. The water from the sewage tank would come out instead. I had to make sure everything looked legitimate, so I took care to clean the outside of the tank and the hose, making sure it looked just like an ordinary irrigation system. If Karen had any doubts about using the hose, I wanted to make sure they didn't come up until it was too late. Once everything was in place, I stepped back and admired my work. The hose looked like any other, normal, ordinary, and completely safe to use. The next few days were an agonizing wait. I kept a close eye on the hose, watching to see if Karen would take the bait. It didn't take long. On the third day, as I was tending to my own garden, I saw her walking up the street toward my house, her eyes scanning the yard for anything to criticize. She was, as usual, looking for some new violation to point out, some new way to make my life miserable. I saw her pause when she noticed the hose lying there, perfectly placed for her use. She didn't even glance toward me as she walked toward it, completely unaware of what awaited her. My heart raced as I hid behind a tree, watching her approach. I felt a strange sense of anticipation, knowing that she would soon be in for a shock. I couldn't help but feel a bit of excitement at the idea that I was finally taking control of the situation. Karen had made me feel powerless for so long. Now it was my turn. She reached for the hose and turned the nozzle. I could hear the water begin to flow, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But that guilt faded quickly as I saw her expression change from casual indifference to horror. The water that came out of the hose wasn't clear. It was murky and foul-smelling. Her face twisted in confusion, and she jerked the hose away from her as the sewage water splashed out. She dropped the hose in panic, stepping back and staring at the disgusting mess. I stayed hidden, trying to stifle my laughter. I knew I shouldn't feel so satisfied, but after everything Karen had put me through, I couldn't help it. It was a moment of sweet, sweet revenge. Karen, horrified, dropped the hose and began frantically looking around. I saw her muttering to herself, probably wondering if she had made some kind of mistake. But the damage was done. There was no way she could ignore what just happened. She looked up, her eyes darting around the yard, and finally, she spotted me standing in the corner of the yard with a barely concealed grin on my face. "What the hell is wrong with your hose?" she yelled. I casually walked over, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, you mean my hose? I thought you might want to use it, but it looks like it's not working too well for you, huh?" Karen's face turned red, and for the first time, she looked genuinely embarrassed. "What did you do?" she demanded. I shrugged innocently. "I didn't do anything. Maybe you should have inspected the hose before you used it." Karen stood there, speechless, completely flustered. It was clear she had no idea what had just happened, and I could tell she was trying to figure out how to save face. I couldn't help myself any longer and burst out laughing. "Karen, I think you just learned a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property. Maybe you should ask before you help yourself to my hose next time." Karen didn't respond. She simply turned and stormed off, muttering to herself as she went. I watched her go, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. I had done it. The hose was no longer a problem. She would never again use it without asking, and maybe, just maybe, this experience would teach her to stop crossing other people's boundaries. That afternoon, I returned to my gardening, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The tension that had built up over time had finally dissipated, and I could breathe easy, knowing Karen wouldn't be showing up at my door anytime soon. My plan had worked, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control. After the sewage tank incident, I thought that Karen would take the hint and never bother me again. To my surprise, however, she didn't confront me directly after the hose incident. For a few days, everything was calm. I didn't see her walking by or hear any more complaints about my garden. I thought maybe she had finally learned her lesson. But as with all things involving Karen, peace didn't last for long. It was a Friday afternoon when I saw her walking down the street again. This time, though, she didn't look her usual smug self. She looked more defeated. As she passed by my house, she didn't even look at my garden. She didn't even glance at the hose. She was, for the first time since we'd met, avoiding me. It seemed like she was in a hurry to get to her own house, and I could tell she was still processing what had happened. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. I'd be lying if I said I didn't take a little joy in seeing Karen humbled. For weeks, she had imposed her petty rules and used my property without permission. To finally have the upper hand felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I couldn't help but feel that this was the end of our ongoing feud. But that Friday, something unexpected happened. Later that afternoon, I received a letter in the mail from the HOA. It wasn't unusual to get correspondence from the HOA. They sent out reminders about property maintenance, fines for minor infractions, and updates on meetings. I opened it, expecting the usual. But as soon as I read the first sentence, my stomach dropped. The letter was a formal notice of a hearing regarding violations of neighborhood standards, specifically about the improper use and maintenance of water equipment. My first thought was that this had to be a joke. The only thing that had ever happened in my yard was that Karen had used my hose without permission, and that was the last thing I'd heard about, at least until now. The letter stated that Karen had filed a formal complaint against me for inappropriate use of water connections and failure to adhere to HOA guidelines regarding garden equipment. It claimed that my hose, in its current condition, violated HOA regulations concerning plumbing safety and water waste management. The complaint was signed by none other than Karen herself. I was stunned. The very person who had been using my hose without permission was now the one accusing me of a violation. It was absurd. Not only that, but the complaint was clearly a retaliation for the sewage tank incident. Karen was using her position on the HOA board to try to get back at me. It felt like an attempt to punish me for putting her in her place. I was furious, but knew I couldn't let this slide. The HOA's rules may be petty, but they still had the power to fine me or even take me to court if I didn't show up for this hearing. I needed to come up with a plan. I couldn't just sit back and let Karen get away with using her position for personal revenge. I immediately called a few neighbors who I knew weren't fans of Karen. I had become friends with some of them over the years, and they were always on the same page when it came to standing up to Karen's antics. They knew exactly what she was like. I explained the situation to them, and to my relief, they agreed to come to the hearing with me as witnesses. We all knew that Karen was the one who had started the problem by using my hose without permission, and now she was trying to turn the tables and make me the villain. The hearing day arrived, and I walked into the HOA's office, my head held high. I had done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to let Karen's vindictive actions get the best of me. When I entered the room, Karen was already seated at the front, looking smug as ever, wearing her usual air of self-importance. The HOA board members, a few of whom I recognized from the neighborhood, nodded as I entered. I could tell they were already a bit skeptical about Karen's claims. It was clear that Karen had overstated things to make me look bad. I walked up to the front, took a seat, and prepared to defend myself. The first thing I noticed was that Karen wasn't looking me in the eye. In fact, she seemed unusually quiet, even though she had a stack of papers in front of her. It looked like she had written up a whole report on how my hose was a hazard and a violation of HOA policies. She began to speak, trying to sound authoritative. "I'm here to report a serious issue with one of my neighbors," she began, her voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "The property owner at my address has been negligent with their garden equipment, particularly the water hose. This hose has been improperly maintained and represents a risk to the neighborhood. I urge the board to take action." I try not to roll my eyes. Was she really going to stand there and pretend that she was the concerned citizen when she was the one who had been using my hose without permission? It was a bold move, but I wasn't about to let her get away with it. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly stood up and addressed the board. I'd like to point out that the complaint being presented here is not only baseless, but it is also retaliatory. Karen has used my property without permission on several occasions. She has used my garden hose to water her plants, wash her car, and more, all without asking. It is only now, after I took action to prevent further misuse of my property, that she decided to file a complaint. The room grew quiet. I could feel Karen's eyes on me, but I didn't back down. As for the claim about the hose being a violation of HOA policies, I find that hard to believe. The hose has been properly maintained, and it's only been used for watering my plants, as it was intended to. There's no reason why it should be considered a hazard. This complaint is an attempt to punish me for something entirely unrelated to HOA rules. The board members exchanged glances, and I could tell they were starting to question the validity of Karen's complaint. They asked her a few questions, trying to dig deeper into the specifics of the alleged violations. Karen struggled to provide clear answers. The more she talked, the more it became evident that she was simply trying to use her position to get back at me. When it was over, the board members voted unanimously to dismiss Karen's complaint. They stated that there was no violation and that Karen's complaint was based on personal vendettas rather than any legitimate concerns about neighborhood safety or rules. It was a huge win for me. I left the hearing feeling victorious. Karen, on the other hand, was fuming. She couldn't believe that the HOA board had sided with me. She left without saying a word to me, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The battle was finally over. The next few weeks were blissfully quiet. Karen didn't bother me again, and I could finally enjoy my garden in peace. It was clear that she had learned her lesson, even if she wouldn't admit it. As for me, I had learned something important too. Sometimes you need to take a stand and defend yourself, even if it means being a little unconventional in the process. And while I didn't relish the conflict, I had no regrets about the steps I took to stand up for my rights. In the end, I didn't just protect my garden hose, I protected my boundaries and my peace of mind. As for Karen, I knew she wouldn't mess with me again. After all, once you've been on the receiving end of sewage tank hose, you're not likely to forget the lesson.